Congratulations, Seth.
Mrs. Cobel on the run, and Ricken turning to the dark side, and much, much more. We get to see more of the goats as well this episode. This video will be breaking down only the details you need to have caught, the most important details, and the details everyone may have missed. Now, this video is a lot later than my typical videos for all of my returning subscribers. I had a work trip this weekend, and I figured you guys would prefer me to wait and still have better audio than to rush a video out with poor editing on my phone or something like that. So I had to wait till I got home in order to film and edit for this episode. And since I figured we all watched the same episode and it's been a couple days now, you guys have probably watched other people's breakdowns of the episode. This video for this episode will be specifically about the details that are important. So hit that subscribe button, like this video so we can hit the algorithm, and let's talk about Severance. Now, the biggest and most important detail that happens in this episode that I don't see enough people talking about, and some people may have missed, surrounds Mrs. Cobel. We see her in her car on her way to figure out where she's going to go. She literally has nowhere to go now that she's left Lumon. Later on, we see that she is going to turn around. Now, first thing I want to point out is that I mentioned in my last video that her car resembles the car in the intro scene. A lot of people feel that it is or isn't her car. Most theories think that it is Gemma's accident. However, I don't believe that's Gemma's accident because we know Gemma actually hit a tree. So whose car is this that is in a lake? Well, I believe that this could be foreshadowing us maybe not having Mrs. Cobel by the end of the season. So keep an eye out for that. But getting back to Mrs. Cobel, we see that she looks at a feeding tube that is in her car. This is the same feeding tube that she had on her shrine to Lumon and her shrine to Eagans that was in her house. On this feeding tube, we see that it is her mother's last name and her mother's birthday. It has been confirmed to be her mother by the writers. This, to me, will tell you everything you need to know about Mrs. Cobel and may reveal what is really going on at Lumon. So starting with the fact that at some point, Mrs. Cobel's mother was a patient of Lumon's, at least a patient that was being treated with Lumon material. It is a Lumon feeding tube. Lumon creates these feeding tube devices that have been used across hospitals across the nation because we know this from the Lexington letter. And I have not seen anybody make this connection, but at the end of the Lexington letter, when they're talking about how they don't believe that this article will do anything, at the end, it literally says, you may remember what happened with the Nashville Tribune, another article, when they printed what they thought was a well-sourced expose on Lumon's feeding tube devices that got sued into oblivion and folded 6 months later. So an entire newspaper company reported on these Lumon feeding tubes, the same tubes that Mrs. Cobel's mother was using at some point in her life. And these same tubes have something more to them. I want to add on the fact that what type of patients need feeding tubes? Patients that are in comas or vegetative states. Remember, I mentioned in previous videos that I believe that Gemma never died and that maybe she was actually in a coma after her accident, and Lumon is utilizing people who are in comas on the testing floor, not people who are dead. I believe that that's going to be the big reveal once we actually find out what's going on the testing floor. And these feeding tubes feed right into that. But keep that in mind that these feeding tube devices, there was something wrong with them. So then that leads me to what possibly can be going on. There was a point in season 1 that I was super confused about Mrs. Cobel's character because yes, she runs the severed floor, but she runs it like as if she actually had created it, not as if she's a hired worker who's being told to do a job. For example, why would she have the power to bring Gemma from the testing floor? Why would she have the power to tell Gemma what to do and schedule the wellness checks? She seemed to have way more power than was initially stated by her role. And she had way more vested interest in how the severance chips work. We later see that she wears a severance chip around her neck. It all starts to connect because this is what's going on. The severance chip on Cobel's neck is her mother. We've seen them reference severance chips in the episodes before, calling them after the person, after their any nickname, not as if it's someone's chip. For example, when she said, "Is this Petey?" She did not say, "Is this Petey's chip?" This is the same thing going on in the chip that she wears around her neck. Her mother is in that chip. She has a vested interest in the severance procedure because since she was a little girl, she's been trained under the Eagans from the Eagans school in order to accomplish whatever they are trying to accomplish. I believe that she has a much more vested role in being part of the creation of the severance procedure and at least studying how it works for the mind. It might be related to whatever she studied while at the Egan School for Girls, and that will then play into her vested role in and why she feels she's so important to be at Lumon. But she just found out that she's not that important and that they feel that they can replace her. But she knows way more because she was a part of its creation and its inception. Now, the question is she a part of its creation and its inception because they used her mother's situation to convince her to work for them? Or is it because Lumon's feeding tube devices were faulty and resulted in her mother's death, and they promised her a reason to bring her back to life? Now, this can play right into the other reason Lumon is creating the severance procedure and what they're actually doing on the severance floor, because as a lot of people's theories, and now mine are starting to feel the same way, they're clearly trying to bring Kira Egan back to life in some way, whether that is he himself in his own body or through somebody else putting his existence and his consciousness into somebody else's mind, but a perfected, refined version of his consciousness, the version of his consciousness that already has the four tempers removed, which is why the screams in the severance floor are them coding someone's brain using numbers to take out the four tempers. With all of that being said, keep up with me. It all starts to make sense now, doesn't it? That is why Cobel has such a deep interest in Lumon. And that is why when she's in her car and she looks to her side and she looks at that feeding tube again, she goes back, because why she's there is bigger than working for Lumon. It's to bring back her mother. And the last thing I want to add, that this may sound crazy, but there is a possibility that on the testing floor, none of these people are dead. Kira Egan might still be alive. As we know, there are historical contexts where there are CEOs who freeze themselves or freeze their brains to be brought back to life. It's not far-fetched to believe that Kira Egan himself had always envisioned a world where Lumon was able to bring people back to life and therefore had his body or his consciousness or his brain already stored. And the same thing could be true for Mrs. Cobel's mother. Her mother could still be down there on that testing floor being preserved in a vegetative state. This is all possible. Same thing with Gemma, and same thing with whoever else might be down there on the testing floor. And then that brings me to the article from episode 1. I was right. I told you guys, pay attention to this information. Just because it's not a truth does not mean there's not some truth in it. I told you guys that every lie is decorated with some form of truth in it. Now, remember that second mystery article talked about how Lumon had revolutionized a way to recycle plastic, and that the chemical component in plastic, polyethylene, aka PE, was how they were doing it. And therefore, I believe that the entirety of Cure PE and everything that exists in this random state that doesn't exist in real life called PE can be hinting to the fact that everything there was created by Lumon and it is not real, and it is based off the fact that it's called PE, just like this polyethylene substance. And that could play into all the recycling bins that we saw in season 1 and their importance. Now we know balloons are super important in season 2, so keep your eyes out for why exactly they are so important and what they truly mean and how they can connect. However, I believe that every single article in this newspaper we saw in episode 1 and every single article we've ever seen in the show. Mind you, I've mentioned all of them in my past videos, so if you haven't seen it already, go check that out. Every single thing we've seen, every single little Easter egg we've been given has played out at some point later on in this show. And this article is no different, because yes, if majority of this newspaper was not real, then why did they have to redact anything on it? That has been my question for everyone since episode 1. So to me, these pieces of information in this newspaper were always going to be Easter eggs that played out later on in the show. And another Easter egg that brings me into my next detail is Ricken. I told you guys from season 1, as soon as he started wearing that dark blue at the end of the show, and I saw how he was running his little book reading club just like a cult that was centered around him, and how all the images and the pictures and the paintings across their entire house were of him. And it was too reminiscent to me of exactly what Kira Egan was doing. I knew that he would come to the dark side, and I knew that the way his wardrobe shifted by the end of season 1 would be the thing that told you. Again, blue, red, green, very important details in this show. This book, I told you guys, that was mentioned in the article in episode 1. These Values 9, How I Let Kira In. Don't be surprised if that's the title of the book Ricken's about to write for Lumon, this new version of his original book for the innies. I told you guys that information was important. All of it will play out later on in this show. So the question is, who is the Baird burglar? Why is that important? And everything else we talked about in this article in my episode 1 breakdown. Let's talk about Irving and Bert, but not about their relationship, but the detail we now find out about the testing floor, or as we now know, it's also called the exports floor. Now, don't be quick to change what you think this place is. I still believe that that is 100% the testing floor. Mrs. Selvig told Milchick to send Gemma back down to the testing floor, and that's where she went. However, I believe that they told O&D that this place is called the Exports Hall so that they would not know what it actually is. We know that everything on the Severance floor at Lumon is infantilized, and therefore, with O&D literally procuring and manufacturing goods on the severed floor, anything that leaves the severed floor would be an infantilized version of exports. So just because they're calling it exports does not mean they're leaving Lumon. They're just going to the testing floor. Now the question becomes is that we know O&D creates all of the Lumon goods that are all over the entire severed floor. We do not actually know if they also create everything in the Lumon building and everything at all Lumon buildings, right? That's a detail we have not confirmed. I'm sure there's an O&D at every single Lumon, and O&D maybe makes everything on the severed floor. We also know that some of these items, maybe a portion of every item they're creating, lands on the testing floor because they're using them to test some of these other severed individuals. The question is for what and why? Or why do they need some of these materials to use for these patients they have on the testing floor, the department that never leaves? All of these things are connected, so keep that in mind. This is still the testing floor. It is also now called the Exports Hall just because they told O&D that that's what it's called. They're telling multiple different departments, multiple different things at all times to keep them all confused and to keep them all separated. Now, speaking of departments, let's talk about this new department, Mamalians Naturable, where all of the goats end up after being in that original goat department they found in season 1. Now, it's clear that they went from being baby goats now transferred into this larger pasture department where they're being raised as goats and being naturalized into what they would do normally as goats. So I find that interesting. We see that there's a man amongst these goats dressed as a leader goat. So are they literally conditioning these goats to recognize a much larger goat as their leader? Keep that in mind. Now, all of these people are here basically farming these goats and taking care of these goats to potentially get them ready for what potentially could be the next process. However, this department is very interesting. We also know that this department met Gemma because Gemma used to work with them. Now, all the people here at this Mammalian Naturable's place are very odd. they keep calling themselves mammalians, and that this department is called Mamalians Naturable. I also think it is a hint that Mark says, if one of your goats went missing, wouldn't you look for her, in reference to them looking for Gemma. There could be some underlying foreshadowing here of where the goats are going and who these people at Mamalians Naturable might actually be. I also want to point out that they say that Gemma comes and does the sessions in their husbandry tanks. Well, the question is, why do they have husbandry tanks, right? Because husbandry tanks are for aquatic animals. What other animals are down here on the severed floor that are being tested on and potentially used for some other process? And why would they be holding sessions in husbandry tanks? Like, were they empty tanks? Were they full tanks? Were these people in the tanks and doing what? So there's a lot more questions to all of this that need to be answered as we continue to watch the rest of this season. But as far as they know, Gemma was retired like they told everyone else. But we know that she was actually, quote unquote, disappeared and sent down to the testing floor. Now, I've seen a lot of people speculate on where Gemma is, and I still believe that she's at this Lumon. We know that they sent her down to the testing floor and that Mark is still working on her file, so she must still be in this Lumon. Now, the next most important detail to talk about are these freaking goats. What are they doing with these goats? Well, I've talked about how pharmacology is something that they're looking for. Neuropharmacology, the study of how different drugs affect the brain, and particularly how they affect people who are having neurological conditions like someone in a coma. Now, it is the study of how drugs affect biological things, aka animals, living things, and human beings. So goats fall under this as well. So the question becomes, what are they studying on the severance floor using goats on the severance floor? Well, obviously they're studying how to sever a goat's mind and a goat's consciousness. And the question is, for what? Well, it is Rebecca. Rebecca is so freaking odd. And we've talked about how it seems like a lot of the people in Cure PE who are not at Lumon are potentially severed individuals as well. They act weird, especially a lot of the people around Ricken. Now, I believe that Rebecca is our most very clear example. Peep out in season 1 at Ricken's reading when Devin said, you have to share a book with Rebecca. She smells weird and she keeps chewing, but she's not chewing on anything. These are two characteristics that people attribute to goats. Goats obviously smell weird because they're animals, but they also chew on nothing. So I believe that Rebecca is one of the test subjects, maybe potentially from the testing floor, who they took a goat's consciousness and put it inside of a human, which is why she is so odd and she has no sense of social cues. She's very, very not in touch with what it means to be a regular human being around other people because she's a goat. And the question now becomes, who else is a goat? Who else came from the Lumon testing floor? Who else has a goat's consciousness put inside of a human being? And the question is, where is the original human being? Is this person someone who was in a coma so that original consciousness is no longer there? Or is it someone who is trapped within their own brain and it starts to get out? So then let's go even further where we talk about Natalie, because there was a detail I caught that I thought was more commentary on the corporate structure, right? Because that same weird twitch she had on her face and smile is something she did with Cobel in season 1, and she did a couple different times in a few other interactions with a few other characters. Now, I thought that this was a commentary on corporate structure, how they'll smile in your face, but they literally tell you something crazy like you're fired or you're not doing your job well, right? And I thought that this awkward smile was kind of like commentating on these awkward forced smiles you have to have in the workplace. However, there may be an undertone that I've seen people mention of this potentially could be a get out situation where there's someone inside of the mind who is trapped and is trying to say something and can't say anything. And this any version, whoever's in Natalie, trying to hide all of the expressions of the original person, the original Natalie that is in her body. 100% could be true. So keep that in mind as we keep watching these episodes. And the small detail from the scene at Mamalians Naturable where they ask to see their stomachs because they want to prove if they have pouches. This is in reference to in season 1, like Bert G told Irving, that the rumor amongst all of the other departments is that MDR employees had pouches where they kept their larvae, which would eventually grow and devour and replace them. There's so many things that can be read into this statement, because during season 1, we thought that this just meant there were all these weird rumors to keep all the departments separate. However, there might be some truth to this statement. They might not have pouches per se, but like we see in the intro, what if Lumon is quite literally growing smaller versions of them, child versions of them, to create them or replace them and replicate themselves? What if they are replications that were put out into the real world who now think that they are the original? What if Miss Wong really is the child of Miss Casey? There's so many different ways that this statement can now be at play on what is actually going on at Lumon. Now, the next important thing to talk about is Helena. We now know it's basically confirmed that this Helly on the severed floor with us right now is not Helly, and it's Helena. Through her awkward actions, the way she talks to Irving, talking about we're here for you, all things Helly wouldn't really do, our sarcastic, rebellious Helly that we're used to, this is not her. She would have said something smart there. She wouldn't have said that. The way she operates with Mark in the hallway in that awkward moment where Mark is probably thinking they may kiss again and she's too awkward to catch the moment is all symptoms of Helena in her natural personality as someone who's probably not been around people in that type of setting as friendly, as nice, as romantic, like someone like Helena, who's stuck in this corporate world where she's the corporate heir. Now that we know that this is Helena and she's doing a great job at pretending to be Helly, the question becomes, will she flip sides? I believe that her story is that the longer she spends down there on the Severance floor, she may either start to have sympathy and connection with some of these people on the severed floor, or she's just so cold-hearted that she's this good at pretending because she's done it all her life, and she's gonna flip a switch by the end of the season where everybody gets in trouble and they all find out that this was Helena all along. So it's gonna be interesting to see where they take her character arc. But she's clearly down there because as these innies think that there's no cameras and there's no microphone, so there's nobody watching them, she is the built-in surveillance. She is reporting on everything that they're doing, and her job is to try to make everything go as smoothly as possible. So we'll see how this goes. She's doing a good job of pretending and not making it obvious, like telling Mark not to look for his wife, right? But eventually it's going to come to a head where she's trying to get Mark to finish Cold Harbor. And just as a reminder from my last video, especially if you haven't watched it and you're new here, Cold Harbor is the Gemma file. And every file we've seen so far in the show is named after a place. Now, some of these places have historical context, a lot of them being related to wars that happened around those areas, but I'm not sure if that's actually the full intention of all of the file names, and just that the file names are all named after places. I believe that these places either align with where they got this person, so i.e. now that we have my coma theory, maybe this is where all the hospitals are, or it could just be that this is where that person is from or where they passed away, died, or entered the coma. Any of those things could be true, but all of the files are people that they are refining, and these people are most likely all people on the testing floor, and the testing floor is the department that quote unquote never leaves, the department that PD found. It is also the department that Irving and his Audi are trying to get into as well, and the reason or the question becomes why? What does Irving's Audi know? Who is Irving's Audi working with, and why are they trying to get to the testing floor? Is all connected to all of these things. I also want to revisit the term revolving. Remember, I told you the process of recycling plastic, like Lumon talks about in their article, reminds me a lot of the word revolving. So maybe that's what they call this process of what they're trying to do, which is recycle human consciousnesses into bodies that are being repurposed and reused, recycling human beings, revolving. So this revolving word could refer to the Eagan CEOs who are having their consciousness revolved, and that could be who is the board. The board could be all of the Eagan consciousnesses that are speaking to each other, all of the past CEOs who are listening in on everything that's happening. So all of this stuff is connected, and now it makes me question more about the tech. We've mentioned how there's a lot of old tech throughout the show, older cars, older computers, older TV screens. However, I want to mention, like I mentioned in my last video, it's not for lack of the technology we're used to today. We've seen Range Rovers in this show, we've seen smartphones in this show, and we've seen flat screen TVs. So now I'm starting to come up with maybe there is some theory. I'm not a tech genius, so maybe somebody watching this video knows better than I do, but maybe there is some form of technology in the past that would be better suitable for communication and for the things that they're doing, even though current technology is more advanced. Think about it that way. That could be why all the tech is so outdated, not because of some other reason of them wanting to look like they're in another, universe or in the past, but because this tech is actually more suitable for the process that they are doing on the testing floor, on the severed floor, and how they're communicating to the board. Keep all of that in mind. Now, the next storyline we need to talk about is Dylan G. We see that he is already acting how Lumon wants him to act now that they've promised him this family contingency, this opportunity to see his family in the severed floor. Now, I personally didn't think that they would really bring a family member into this, but they did, which I think opens up a world of a lot of commentary on moral and ethical practices when it comes to where the storyline is clearly going. Now, they take Dylan G to meet his Audi's wife, which is technically, I guess, in a way, his wife, right? But we see this interaction. It starts off odd. His wife is definitely sitting there taking in what she's seeing. And what I believe is being missed by a lot of people breaking down this episode is what is really going on in Dylan's Audi's wife's brain. We later on in the episode get to see Dylan G in the real world. He is a couch potato who barely knows how to function and take care of his own kids. He almost just lost his job, but he got it back, and there's a lot going on. His wife clearly works nights, and based off her uniform, she is probably some sort of security guard somewhere. I believe that's what her uniform looks like. Now, I also think that she could potentially maybe have a secondary job at Lumon as someone who is not severed, so keep that in mind. Dylan's wife is not looking at some Audi who's just the man she wishes Dylan was. She's looking at an Audi who is the man Dylan's wife married, because keep it in context, right? There's no reason for Dylan's wife to tell a stranger in some aspects that she loves him. She's familiar with this version of Dylan from before, which is why she says that. She's reminiscing over the feelings she used to have with the real Dylan G. That is the actual detail I think that is underneath this scene that will start to explain where this might go. She is looking at a man who is the man that she married, and the man that she actually married is no longer there. He's no longer the man he used to be. That Dylan G got lost along the way and now is in this place that he is as his Audi, but his innie has that original Dylan G, the Dylan G that was before the world got to him, right? That's how I feel about it. Also, peep how the magazine that he's reading is called Midlife Driver. I think it's a, hint at the fact that Dylan G, his Audi, is having a midlife crisis. So all the details are all intentional, including the cartoon Dylan G's son, I think, is watching. Son, daughter, we'll find out, I guess, but I think it's son. So all that hair is amazing, by the way. That is not, throwing any shots. But that cartoon that they focused on so that you would see the shot of the thing inside someone's brain. This is exactly commentary on what we're seeing happen in Lumon. So referencing this cartoon, I'm going to show you guys this video I found on TikTok. Shout out to this guy, J Buck. He's great, and he's going to break down this cartoon.
while there's a suspicious cartoon his kids are watching. This is an episode of the 80s, early 90s cartoon Danger Mouse. Now, I did way too much digging, and this is Season 3, Episode 1, titled The Invasion of Colonel K. Colonel K? Kier Egan? Danger Mouse has to shrink down into Colonel K, who is described as an extraordinary, eccentric man, again like Kier Egan. They enter his mind and body because another spaceship has entered his mind, alluding to a Severance chip. They have to navigate an endless series of tunnels, pipes, and so forth, like the severed employees do in the endless hallways. They speak using a voice box, while the board at Lumon tends to use a speaker box. To be clear, this could solely be Severance propaganda used on children in this world, or if this is a clue like much of Severance has been, what if they are shrinking down into like a digital landscape, almost a simulation of Kier Egan's mind?
So now that you've seen how detailed this show is, nothing in this show is an accident. Pay attention to every background show on the TVs, every article you've ever seen in this show, everything that's happening, because everything is important. But his theory opens up what our comments opened up, which is this RGB concept of red, blue, and green. Is this somehow what is being used to create this false reality? And all the colors we keep seeing everywhere is trying to tell us that nothing we are watching is real. Kier PE is not even real. Everyone here is not even real. And that everyone in Kier PE has been given their life is the entire show, this world we're watching in Severance, the Matrix itself. So all of these things are connected. I think nothing is a coincidence, and it's going to be crazy to see some of these reveals when they finally happen. And now for the last detail, but not the least important, we know by at the end of the episode that Mark decides to get reintegrated. The only way to get in contact with his innie to find out what is going on and to find out where Gemma is and if she's alive is to reintegrate himself from the severance procedure. But I want to talk about what we learn about the severance procedure through this scene. Dr. Agabi tells us that the chip works by separating the 5 brainwave frequencies, which are a real thing in science: delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. I also believe that there is no coincidence that the colors of these waves are referenced as blue, green, red, orange, and yellow. All colors we see prominently throughout the show in quite a few different ways. Also referencing those balloons we saw in the break room and quite a few other huge details. Now, the blue references delta waves, which are deep sleep, transcendence, and restoration. So with them referencing everything related to Lumon in blue, it's literally like talking about you're still asleep, you're still up, you're still in the Matrix, you're still following what you're being told. And green, visualization, trance, and dreaming. So P-PAL, delta, and theta are also closely related as well, where blue means you're fully asleep, but green also can mean that you're dreaming or in a trance-like state being controlled. The severance chip is the blue and green chip. We know that everything at Lumon is referenced in blue and green for the most part. All of these things are intentional. Keep those things in mind. Where red is talking about insight, peak experiences, and synchronization, and those are gamma waves. I also believe all the red we've been seeing throughout the show, like I mentioned, not only references the people who are going against Lumon, but it also references the people who are looking for answers, looking for insight. And synchronization can also be referencing reintegration. But now for the rest of this season, we're going to see an integrated Mark who is experiencing both worlds and trying to find answers. But I believe that is all for me today. These are the most important details that you might have caught, that you need to have caught, and that most people may have missed. Let me know down in the comment section anything else you may have caught in this episode that you wish to talk about. Like this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.